Every morning at 9:12, the dog barked at the front door, the exact minute my husband's heart had stopped. The first time it happened, I thought Rusty was just restless. The second morning, I checked the clock without meaning to. The third, I stood in the hallway and waited. Sure enough, the moment the minute hand touched 12, he trotted to the door, tail low, and gave one short bark. Not loud, not frantic, just certain. Then he sat down, as if expecting someone to come home. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe if you've ever loved someone so much their habits outlived them. Arthur had been gone 12 days when I started counting the barks. 12 mornings since the paramedics had carried his body out, while Rusty pressed his nose to the doorframe, whining low in his throat. The house had been full of people then, casseroles, condolences, perfumed hugs that smelled like obligation. Now it was just me and the old retriever, our routines tangled like roots. Rusty had been Arthur's shadow. Every morning they'd walk the same loop around the neighborhood, always back by 9. Arthur would feed him, pour coffee, and whistle off-key until I threatened to hide the sugar. Now, at 9:12, Rusty sat at the door waiting for a man who wasn't coming back. The house still carried Arthur's rhythm. His jacket hung on the peg by the stairs. His reading glasses sat beside the armchair. I couldn't bring myself to move them yet. Grief isn't a storm that hits once. It's a clock that refuses to stop ticking. Rusty scratched once at the door, then looked back at me, head tilted, as if to say, "Aren't you going to let him in?" His eyes were clouded with age, but there was something sharp behind them, a kind of remembering I didn't understand. "Not today, boy," I murmured. "He's gone." He sighed, an honest human sound, then laid his chin on his paws. The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise. Outside, the world kept on being ordinary. A mail truck hummed by, a neighbor's wind chime fluttered in the breeze. Inside, the air felt too still, too expectant. I poured coffee I wouldn't finish and sat by the window, watching Rusty's reflection in the glass. Every few minutes, his ears twitched, as if listening for footsteps. The same sunlight that used to warm Arthur's shoulders now fell across Rusty's fur, turning the gray in his coat to threads of gold. When Arthur was alive, he used to say dogs know more than we give them credit for. They read the air, he'd insist. They remember what we forget. I'd laughed then, too practical to believe in such things. But now, every morning, that bark at 9:12 made me wonder if remembering was exactly what Rusty was doing, for both of us. That evening, as I locked up the house, Rusty padded to the door again and sniffed along the bottom edge, tail flicking. He whined once, low and searching, then lay down and refused to move. I spread a blanket beside him and sat there on the floor, listening to the tick of the clock and the quiet sigh of wind through the trees. In the stillness, I whispered, "You miss him too, don't you?" Rusty didn't lift his head, but his tail thumped once, slow and steady. I stroked his fur until his breathing deepened, his body warm against my leg. Outside, the moonlight fell across the threshold, that fragile line between waiting and letting go. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was more than habit. Rusty wasn't just keeping watch, he was keeping time. And tomorrow at 9:12, we'd both be listening again. The days after a funeral are strange things. The world pretends to go back to normal, but everything inside the house feels slightly off, like a picture frame that's just a little crooked. People stop calling as often. The flowers droop in their vases. Food you didn't cook starts to taste like dust. I tried to build a new routine in the hollows Arthur left behind. I woke up without an alarm because his cough and the clink of his mug weren't there to pull me out of sleep. I made half as much coffee and poured half of that down the sink. I washed a single plate at night instead of 2. Grief, it turns out, is learning to divide by 1. Rusty, however, refused to revise anything. He still slept on the rug by Arthur's side of the bed. He still circled the kitchen twice before breakfast, nails clicking against the tile in a rhythm that had once synced perfectly with Arthur's slippers. And every morning at 9:12, he took his place by the front door as if answering a roll call only he could hear. On the 5th morning, I tried ignoring him. I stayed in the bedroom, folding laundry that didn't need folding, pretending not to notice when the clock in the hallway chimed 9 soft times. At the 12th minute past, a single bark cut through the house, clear and measured, then silence. I carried the stack of towels to the linen closet and found myself pausing by Arthur's dresser. His watch lay where he'd left it, the band curved as if still hugging his wrist. I picked it up and pressed the side button. The digital face flickered weakly. 9:13. The second hand on the old wall clock ticked in the hall, just half a breath behind. "Too late," I murmured. "We're always a minute too late." Rusty padded down the hall then, nails tapping the hardwood. He nudged my elbow with his nose, eyes bright. For a dog his age, he moved with surprising purpose, like someone trying to deliver a message in a language no one else spoke. "What is it?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "What are you trying to tell me?" He turned and trotted back toward the stairs, pausing halfway to look over his shoulder. It was the same gesture he used to make when Arthur called him for walks. "Come on, slowpoke." Without quite knowing why, I followed. Downstairs, he went straight to the front door and sat, staring at the lower corner of the frame. Not the glass, not the handle, the wood near the floor, where years of scuffs had dulled the paint. He sniffed along the baseboard, then pawed at it gently, claws scraping once, twice, 3 times. I frowned. "There's nothing there, Rusty." He pawed again, more insistently this time, then let out a soft, frustrated whine. I sank to my knees beside him, my joints protesting. The floor was cool against my legs. From this angle, I could see the tiny hairline cracks in the paint, the uneven seam where the trim met the wall. It looked ordinary. Lifetimes hide in ordinary things. "Arthur, what did you do?" I whispered, more to myself than to the dog. I pressed my fingers along the seam and felt it, the faintest give, like something had been pried open once and then carefully closed again. A memory floated up, a Saturday last winter, Arthur kneeling by the door with a screwdriver, explaining, or pretending to explain, that he was fixing a draft. I'd been in the kitchen cooking stew, only half listening. "Cold air'll sneak in anywhere it can," he'd said then, tapping the baseboard. "Best to seal it up proper." At the time, I'd believed him. Now the words rang different. Maybe it wasn't cold air he was worried about. Maybe it was time. Rusty nudged my hand toward the floor, his breath warm against my wrist. His tail wagged once, uncertain but hopeful. "All right," I said, exhaling. "You win." I fetched a flathead screwdriver from the junk drawer in the kitchen, the one Arthur always said he'd organize and never did. When I came back, Rusty had settled into a tight, attentive sit, like a student waiting for a lesson. Carefully, I slid the tip of the screwdriver into the seam where the paint had cracked. The wood resisted at first, then gave with a soft pop. A narrow section of baseboard lifted away, revealing a shallow hollow behind it. My heart climbed into my throat. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine, was a small tin box. Rusty's nose darted into the opening before I could stop him, sniffing urgently. He let out a low chuff and stepped back, as if saying, "There, I told you." My hands shook as I pulled the box free. It was dented in one corner, the metal cool and familiar, the kind of container people used to keep buttons or sewing needles in. Arthur's mother had had one just like it. On the lid, scratched faintly into the surface as if by a key or a nail, were 3 letters, E-M-A. Evelyn and Arthur's initials entwined. The breath left my body. I sat down hard on the floor, the box resting in my lap. Rusty laid his head on my knee, eyes watching my face with almost human concern. "You clever, stubborn man," I whispered. "What did you leave me?" The twine came loose with one tug. I lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded envelope, yellowed at the edges, and something else, a small, worn rectangle of leather that looked like it had once been a wallet. My name was written on the envelope in Arthur's hand. Rusty's tail thumped once against the floor. The clock in the hallway ticked on, steady and unbothered. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed, a bird sang, the world continued. But inside our little house, time held its breath. I traced my thumb over my name, written by a hand I'd held for 50 years. The ink had bled slightly, like he'd pressed too hard. I swallowed, my throat tight. "Okay," I said softly, to the box, to the dog, to the empty air between us. "We'll open it, but not standing up." I pushed myself upright, every bone in my body protesting, and carried the box to the living room armchair, Arthur's chair. Rusty followed, sitting squarely in front of me, keeping vigil. I settled into the worn cushion, the indent of his body still there, and placed the box on my lap again. The house went quiet in that particular way it does when something important is about to be remembered. With a breath that felt like a goodbye and a beginning all at once, I slid my finger under the flap of the envelope and began to open it. The paper was thin, the kind that threatens to tear just from being remembered. Arthur's handwriting leaned slightly to the right, neat but rushed, like he was trying to say too much before the pen ran dry. The first line made my hands tremble. "If you're reading this, Evie, it means I didn't get the chance to say everything out loud." I stopped there for a moment, pressing my lips together. Rusty let out a low breath, his chin resting on my foot. The clock in the hallway ticked so softly it sounded like it was holding its own heartbeat. I've known for a while now. The doctors called it manageable. They were wrong. I didn't tell you because you've spent our whole marriage worrying about everyone else, and I wanted you to have one season of peace, even if it came at my expense. You always said honesty is love's backbone. I hope you can forgive me for bending it just this once. My throat closed. I could see him in the hospital, that calm smile, the way he'd said, "It's just a bit of tiredness," when he'd stopped walking Rusty for long stretches. I thought I'd believed him because I wanted to. Maybe I'd just believed in the life we'd built, one so solid it felt indestructible. There's something you'll find with this letter, that old leather wallet of mine. Inside it is a folded note from our first year together. I found it cleaning the garage a few months ago and couldn't bear to throw it away. I wanted you to see how far we came from that naive pair who thought love was just laughter and coffee refills. I reached into the tin and pulled out the wallet. It cracked softly as I opened it, the leather stiff from disuse. Inside was exactly what he'd described, a folded scrap of paper, yellowed, edges curled. I opened it carefully. It was a grocery list: bread, sugar, coffee beans, and at the bottom, in capital letters, "Don't forget to kiss her good morning." My breath left me all at once. I laughed, then sobbed, then laughed again, the kind of sound that doesn't know what direction to take. Rusty lifted his head, worried, then settled again when I scratched behind his ears. "Your dad was a fool," I said softly to the dog, "a sweet one." Arthur's letter continued. "I left Rusty in charge because he listens better than either of us ever did. Every morning he'll sit by the door, same time as my heart stopped. It isn't superstition, Evie. I trained him to do it months ago before things got bad. I wanted him to remind you that love doesn't end at the hospital door. You still have reasons to stand up, open the curtains, and step outside. Let him lead you the way he always led me. When you feel ready, open the door at 9:12 and walk with him. He'll know where to go. There's something waiting out there for you, a small thing, but it'll make sense when you see it. I lowered the page into my lap. The words blurred through tears, the ink swimming in light. My whole chest felt hollow and full at once, like every inhale had to travel through years. "Rusty," I whispered, voice cracking. "You knew." He tilted his head, ears perking. The look in his eyes wasn't confusion, it was recognition. He thumped his tail once, stood, and walked to the front door. Then he sat down, exactly where he always did, and looked back at me. 9:12 hadn't come yet. The clock showed 9:05. 7 minutes. 7 minutes that felt like the longest I'd ever lived. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope as if it could still feel pain. My fingers brushed the groove of Arthur's initials scratched into the tin lid, EMA. The metal was cold, grounding. At 9:10, I stood. My legs felt unsteady, but the floor beneath me seemed to know where to guide them. Rusty rose with me, tail brushing against my calf. Together, we waited. When the clock's minute hand reached 12, Rusty barked once, that same certain sound, sharp and brief, like the strike of a bell. I took the handle in my hand. The brass was cool against my skin. The sunlight outside was almost white, bright enough to make me squint. The air carried the faint scent of lilacs, Arthur's favorite, the same bush he'd planted by the fence years ago. I hadn't noticed until that moment how much it had bloomed. Rusty stepped forward, stopping halfway down the porch. He looked back at me, tail wagging, as if to say, "See?" I followed, blinking against the light. The world felt the same and different all at once. Every blade of grass, every creak of the porch boards sounded amplified, alive. At the bottom step, something caught my eye, a small wooden box half buried beneath a lilac bush. It looked new. Rusty pawed at the dirt around it, then sat back, expectant. "Arthur," I breathed, kneeling down. My heart stuttered in my chest. Rusty leaned against my shoulder as I brushed away the soil. The box had a note taped to the top, written in Arthur's shaky handwriting, "For your first walk alone." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I reached for the latch. Whatever he'd hidden there, it had waited, just like Rusty, quietly, patiently, certain that love could outlast death if it had a schedule to keep. The latch gave way with a soft snap. Inside the small wooden box was a folded piece of fabric, Arthur's old handkerchief, the one with the blue stitching he carried everywhere. It smelled faintly of cedar and the ghost of his aftershave. Beneath it lay a silver key on a short length of twine and a small note scrawled in his unmistakable handwriting. "For the place I told you I'd fix someday." I turned the key in my fingers. It was worn smooth, the teeth dulled with years of use. Rusty nosed at it, then looked toward the back of the yard. The lilac branches swayed gently in the breeze, parting just enough to reveal the edge of Arthur's old tool shed. "Of course. Come on, boy," I said softly, my voice breaking on the last word. Rusty trotted ahead, tail low, pausing every few steps to glance back, as if making sure I was following. The grass was wet from last night's rain, cool against my ankles. When we reached the shed, I noticed the lock on the door, small, rusted, but clearly still functional. I slid the key into it. It fit perfectly, like time had been waiting for this moment. The door creaked open, releasing a puff of air that smelled of sawdust and oil. Light filtered through a dusty window, catching on the outline of old tools hanging on hooks. Everything was just as Arthur had left it, organized, precise, yet lived in the quiet chaos of someone who'd built things with both hands and heart. On the workbench sat another note, weighed down by a small wooden bird carved from oak. Its wings were spread mid-flight, delicate and imperfect, the grain of the wood showing through like veins. I reached out and touched it, feeling the familiar ridges of Arthur's handiwork. "This one's for you, Evie. I carved it the week I knew I'd be leaving soon. I thought you'd need a reason to open the shed again." My breath caught. He'd always called me Evie when he wanted to soften the edges of a hard truth. "You told me once that if anything ever happened to me, you'd shut this place up and never come back. Please don't. The world keeps building even when we stop. Rusty knows the way out here because I trained him. I wanted him to remind you that love builds, not buries." The words blurred. I set the note down and picked up the little bird, its surface smooth from sandpaper and care. It fit perfectly in my palm, small enough to be pocketed, strong enough to hold a story. Rusty barked once, startling me. He was staring at the far wall where a calendar hung, its pages yellowed but still intact. The date circled in red was June 4, the day of Arthur's last checkup, the day he'd told me everything's fine. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I guess you weren't fixing a draft that day either," I whispered. The dog wagged his tail, the sound thumping softly against the floorboards. I laughed through tears. "You two and your secrets." I sat on the stool by the workbench, the bird in one hand, the note in the other. Through the small window, I could see the lake glinting in the distance, the same lake we'd driven to every summer for 40 years. Arthur had promised to fix the dock one last time before he got sick. He never did. Maybe that's what he meant in his letter, the place he'd fix someday. I looked down at Rusty. "You think that's it, boy? The lake?" He tilted his head, ears perked, then barked once, that same quiet certainty I was beginning to recognize as yes. I glanced at the clock on the shed wall. The hands trembled toward 9. My chest tightened. "All right," I said. "Tomorrow morning, 9:12. We'll walk there. You can show me the way." Rusty wagged his tail as if he understood, then laid down at my feet, head resting on his paws. I leaned back against the wall, the smell of cedar and rain wrapping around me like memory. I stayed there for a long time, thinking about how Arthur had planned this, not to haunt me, but to guide me. Each clue had been his way of leaving me steps toward the light. He'd known I'd follow the routine because grief is nothing if not obedient. When I finally stood, the sunlight had shifted, filling the shed with warm, golden light. Dust floated through it like confetti, tiny pieces of time dancing in the air. I placed the carved bird in my pocket, locked the shed, and turned back toward the house. Rusty padded beside me, shoulder brushing my leg. His fur smelled like earth and the faint sweetness of lilac. Halfway across the yard, he stopped and looked up at me. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not sadness, not even hope, but understanding. "Yeah," I said softly, "I get it. You're not waiting for him anymore. You're waiting for me to catch up." He thumped his tail once, and we walked the rest of the way home together. That night, I set the tin box on the kitchen table beside the bird and the letter. For the first time in weeks, I didn't dread the next morning. I knew what came next: a walk, a door opening, and a chance to breathe outside the walls of loss. Rusty curled up by the door as always, his tail curled over his nose, his breathing slow and even. The house, for once, didn't feel empty. It felt patient. And at 9:12 the next morning, I promised myself I'd open the door first. The next morning came soft and pale, the kind of light that feels more like a whisper than a sunrise. The air smelled of dew and lilac, and for the first time since Arthur's funeral, I didn't dread the clock. I dressed before it struck 9, slipped the little wooden bird into my pocket, and whistled for Rusty. He came trotting from the living room, tail wagging, eyes bright with purpose. The years seemed to fall away from him in that moment. He looked young again, ready for a walk with his favorite person. Maybe grief had aged me and reversed him, like he'd borrowed Arthur's youth just long enough to lead me through this one last thing. At 9:11, I stood by the door, hand on the knob. Rusty sat in his usual spot, head high, waiting for the cue. The hallway clock ticked louder than it ever had before, each sound carving a space between the seconds. When the minute hand touched 12, Rusty gave his single bark, firm, certain, the sound that had haunted and comforted me for days. "All right, boy," I said, voice trembling, "let's go." The hinges groaned softly as I opened the door. The world smelled clean, washed overnight by spring rain. The lilac bush shimmered with droplets, tiny beads of light catching on the leaves. Rusty bounded ahead, paws sinking into the wet grass. I followed, closing the door behind me for the first time in weeks without looking back. He led me down the old path behind the house, the one Arthur used to take to the lake. My feet knew it before I did. The earth was soft, the air damp, and every step stirred up memories. Arthur's laughter when I'd lag behind, the way he'd pretend to race Rusty and always lose on purpose. As we walked, the world slowly woke. Birds sang somewhere overhead, their notes weaving between the trees. A squirrel darted across the path, and Rusty paused only long enough to watch it disappear into the brush before moving on. He didn't bark. He was focused. When we reached the bend that opened onto the water, I stopped. The lake glimmered under the rising sun, perfectly still, like a piece of glass that had forgotten how to break. The old dock stretched out from the bank, weathered but sturdy, Arthur's handiwork. I could almost hear him saying, "One day I'll fix that railing." Rusty trotted to the edge of the dock and sat, facing the water. His tail brushed against the boards. I joined him, lowering myself slowly onto the wood. The lake reflected everything, sky, trees, even our shadows, 2 figures outlined in light. From my pocket, I took the little wooden bird. It felt warm now, as if it had absorbed the morning. "You carved this for me," I murmured, turning it over in my hand, "and somehow you carved your way back to me through him." Rusty's ears twitched, and he rested his head on my knee. I stroked his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. The world felt full again, not with noise, but with presence. Arthur wasn't gone, he'd just changed his routine. I reached into the tin box I'd brought and took out the letter. The paper fluttered in the breeze. "I read your words, Arthur," I said softly, "every one of them, and I'm here, just like you asked. You were right. Love doesn't stop. It just changes where it waits." A single tear slipped down my cheek, but it didn't sting. It felt like gratitude. Rusty suddenly stood, his nose pointing toward the far side of the lake. I followed his gaze. There, just beyond the trees, a flock of birds rose into the air, their wings catching the light. It looked almost rehearsed, like they'd been waiting for the right cue. Rusty wagged his tail once, watching them until they disappeared into the clouds. "Message received," I whispered. We stayed there until the sun climbed high enough to dry the dew from the dock. Rusty lay beside me, eyes half closed, his head heavy on my foot. I didn't rush to leave. For the first time since Arthur died, I didn't feel the need to. Eventually, I stood and brushed the dirt from my hands. "Come on, old boy," I said, "let's go home." Rusty hesitated, looking at the lake one last time before turning back toward the path. I followed, one hand resting in my pocket around the small wooden bird. The walk back felt shorter, lighter, like something inside me had unclenched. When we reached the porch, Rusty climbed the steps and sat again by the door. He looked at me, not waiting this time, but watching. I smiled. "You did good, Rusty," I said, unlocking the door. "You both did." Inside, the house smelled different, not emptier, but aired out, like the windows had finally opened. I set the bird on the mantel next to Arthur's photo. For a moment, I could almost hear his laugh, that quiet chuckle that always started deep in his chest. Rusty settled back on the rug, curling into himself. His eyes met mine, soft and satisfied. I knelt beside him, pressing my forehead gently to his. "Thank you," I whispered. "You brought me back to the door." He wagged his tail once, then exhaled deeply, his body relaxing completely. The steady rhythm of his breathing filled the room, syncing with the clock in the hallway. Tomorrow, I decided, I would open the door again, not to wait, but to walk. The following morning, I woke before the alarm, before the light even touched the curtains. Something in the air felt different, lighter, calmer, as if the house itself had exhaled overnight. Rusty wasn't at the foot of the bed like usual. For a moment, panic struck hard and sharp. Then I heard the faint tap of nails on the hallway floor. He was already at the door, waiting. But not sitting as before. This time he stood, tail wagging slowly, watching me, as if to say, "It's your turn now." I slipped into my robe, the fabric brushing against my ankles, and joined him. The morning light glowed faintly through the window panes, soft and blue. I crouched down beside him, scratching the fur behind his ear. "You ready, old boy?" He blinked, pressed his nose to my wrist, and leaned in close. The clock in the hall ticked toward 9, then 9:11. My heart began to match its rhythm. When the minute hand reached 12, I opened the door. No bark this time, no command, just the quiet sound of hinges moving aside for something sacred. The breeze slipped through the doorway, carrying the scent of damp earth and lilacs. Rusty stepped out first, then stopped on the porch and turned toward me. The sun caught his fur, outlining him in gold. I had never seen him look so peaceful. We walked together again, but slower this time. My knees complained, the way they always did, but the path felt shorter somehow. Each step filled with something that wasn't pain anymore. Gratitude, maybe. When we reached the edge of the yard, Rusty hesitated, then veered off toward the lilac bush. He nosed through the petals, sniffed the damp soil, and gave a small, satisfied huff. I laughed softly. "You found everything, didn't you? Every last secret he left for us." He looked up at me then, eyes clouded but still bright, and I saw Arthur in that gaze, steady, patient, endlessly kind. Rusty turned once, circled, and lay down beneath the lilacs. The sunlight dappled his fur through the branches, warm and gentle. I sank to my knees beside him. "Hey," I whispered, "don't you fall asleep on me yet?" He looked at me once more, tail brushing lightly against the ground, then placed his head on his paws. His breathing slowed, deep and even. The world went still around us. No wind, no birdsong, just the faint rhythm of my heart and his, somehow in sync. I don't know how long I sat there, my hand on his side, feeling each rise and fall grow softer. The clock in the house must have struck 10, then 11, then noon, but I didn't move. When the last breath finally came, it was as quiet as the end of a lullaby. "Good boy," I whispered, tears catching in my throat. You did your job." The breeze stirred again, carrying the scent of lilacs over us. I looked up through the branches and saw a single petal detach, swirling upward instead of down. It rose higher, spinning, then vanished into the sunlight. I buried him there, under the lilacs heat-guarded every morning. I used Arthur's old spade from the shed, the handle worn smooth by his hands. The earth was soft and forgiving. When I was done, I sat back on my heels and pressed the wooden bird into the soil above Rusty's resting place. Its carved wings caught the light, throwing a sliver of brightness against the fresh mound. Afterward, I stayed there, leaning against the porch rail. The air was warm, the silence kind. I realized with a strange clarity that I wasn't alone, not really. Arthur's love had lingered through a letter, Rusty's through his devotion. Between the two of them, they'd built me a bridge back to living. When I finally went inside, I opened all the windows, the house filled with birdsong and sunlight. I brewed 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then smiled and poured one into Arthur's old mug. It felt right somehow, even if it stayed untouched. At 9:12 the next morning, the door stayed closed. The house didn't need reminding anymore. The silence didn't ache, it hummed with memory. I stood at the window and looked toward the lilacs, their blooms swaying gently in the breeze. A small bird, a real one this time, not carved, landed on the branch above Rusty's resting place. It sang a few bright notes, short and clear, then flew off toward the lake. And just like that, the clock in the hallway ticked on, steady, ordinary, alive again. I whispered, "Good morning, boys," and smiled through the tears. Because some love stories don't end, they simply learn how to keep time differently. The days that followed were gentler, quieter, in a way that didn't hurt. The house no longer felt haunted by absence, it felt watched over. Every morning, sunlight streamed across the floorboards, falling right where Rusty used to sleep. The space he'd guarded was still there, but instead of emptiness, it held warmth. Grief, I realized, changes its shape. At first, it's heavy, like carrying a box you can't set down. Then, slowly, it becomes something smaller, something you can tuck into a pocket, take out only when you need to remember. That's what Rusty had given me. He'd carried the heaviest part until I could hold it myself. I spent the next week tending to the garden. The lilacs bloomed brighter than they ever had before, their scent following me everywhere. When I watered them, the soil darkened around the wooden bird marking Rusty's resting place. Sometimes I'd talk to him, the way you do when you know no one's listening, but somehow believe they still hear. "I'm all right, you know," I'd tell him. "He was right. You kept me walking." On the 7th morning, as I knelt among the flowers, I noticed something half buried near the lilac roots. A small metal tag shaped like a heart. I dug it out carefully. It was Rusty's old collar tag, polished by rain and time. The engraving read simply, "Good boy." I laughed, a real laugh this time, the kind that comes from surprise and love meeting halfway. "You're still finding ways to show off, huh?" I threaded the tag onto a thin chain and wore it around my neck beside Arthur's wedding ring. Together, they felt like anchors, not weights pulling me down, but reminders that I belonged to a story still unfolding. Later that afternoon, Ryan came by with Maya. She bounded through the house the way children do, wide-eyed, curious, untouched by silence. "Grandma," she said, "Daddy told me Rusty went to heaven." "Yes," I said gently, smoothing her hair. "He finally went to see Arthur." She nodded thoughtfully. "Do dogs know how to find people up there?" "Oh, sweetheart," I said, smiling. "Rusty would never lose his way." Maya peeked out the window toward the garden. "Can I see where he sleeps now?" "Of course." We walked to the lilac bush together. The petals fluttered softly in the wind. Maya crouched down, touching the wooden bird. "It's pretty," she said. "Did you make it?" "Arthur did, a long time ago." She looked up at me with solemn eyes, far too wise for her age. "He must have known you'd need it." I nodded. He always did. Maya sat quietly for a moment, then said, "Can I leave something too?" "Of course," I said again. She ran inside and returned with a small seashell from her pocket, one she'd collected from the lake last summer. She placed it beside the wooden bird and patted the soil gently. "For Rusty," she said, "so he can hear the ocean." I swallowed hard, feeling something loosen deep inside my chest. "He'll like that," I said softly. Ryan stood a few steps behind us, his eyes glistening. When Maya wandered off to chase butterflies, he said quietly, "You seem lighter, Mom." "I am," I said. "Grief's a strange thing. It doesn't leave you, but it learns to walk beside you instead of in front." He nodded, looking toward the lake in the distance. "I think Dad would have liked that you're back outside." "He made sure of it," I said, smiling faintly. He and Rusty had a plan. The wind picked up, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. Somewhere, a bird sang a short, clear note, and for a second, it felt like a familiar whistle I used to hear on quiet mornings. Arthur's off-key tune, echoing from memory. I didn't turn to look for it. I just listened and let the sound fill the space between us. That evening, after Ryan and Maya left, I sat by the open window, the air warm and sweet. The collar tag around my neck clinked softly against the ring when I breathed. On the mantel, the wooden bird caught the last rays of light. The shadows stretched long across the floor, touching the doorway where Rusty used to wait. I whispered into the dusk, "Thank you for staying until I could stand." The wind stirred the curtains, gentle as a reply. When I went to bed that night, I didn't leave the hallway lamp on. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I understood now that love doesn't vanish, it changes form. Sometimes it wears a ring, sometimes a collar tag, sometimes just the sound of a familiar bark echoing in your heart. And tomorrow, when the clock struck 9:12, I wouldn't listen for it. I'd be outside already, walking. A month passed before I realized that the sound of 9:12 no longer carried weight. The clock still ticked, of course, it always would. But that minute no longer held its old ache. It was simply a moment now, folded into the rest of the day like a stitch in a much larger quilt. Most mornings, I woke before the sun. I'd pour 1 cup of coffee, not 2, and step outside to sit on the porch steps. The lilac bush glowed faintly in the early light, dew clinging to each petal like tiny prayers. The air smelled of earth and calm. The wooden bird had faded slightly under the weather, but it still looked ready to fly. I spoke to them both, Arthur and Rusty, the way one talks to old friends who never really left. "You two can rest easy," I'd say. "We're doing fine down here." And it was true. The house had changed shape, but not meaning. I'd cleared out some of Arthur's things, his jackets, his books, but I'd kept the watch and the old coffee mug, the things that still carried warmth. Every time I glanced at them, I felt less haunted and more held. One afternoon, I invited Maya to spend the weekend. She filled the rooms with her chatter, with crayons scattered across the table, and the sound of little feet running down the hall. That kind of noise, life noise, was the best kind of healing. "Grandma," she asked over dinner, "how did Rusty know what to do?" I smiled, "Because someone taught him." "Who?" "Someone who loved us both very much." She thought for a moment, then nodded. "He must have been a good teacher." "The best," I said. After she went to bed, I sat by the open window. The moonlight stretched across the garden, silvering the grass. I could hear the lake in the distance, faint waves brushing the shore. I thought of that last walk, the way Rusty had looked back to make sure I was following, the way Arthur must have looked at me once, long ago, when I was too afraid to step forward. They'd both taught me the same lesson in their own ways, that love doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes, love is the gentle hand that lets you walk through the door and keeps the light on behind you. I reached for my journal and began to write, not about grief or loss, but about the small details that made up the days. The sound of rain on the roof, the first bloom of the lilacs, the laughter of a child chasing butterflies. Things worth remembering. When I finished, I closed the book and whispered to the quiet house, "We're still building, Arthur, just like you asked." Outside, the wind stirred, carrying the faintest echo of a bark, soft, distant, content. I smiled. The next morning, when the clock's hands met at 9:12, I was already walking down the garden path. The air was crisp, alive. Birds darted between branches, their wings cutting the light. The lilacs rustled gently as I passed, brushing against my sleeve like a blessing. I reached the gate, turned the latch, and stepped into the world with the ease of someone who'd finally learned that love doesn't need to wait by the door. It walks beside you, quietly, faithfully, forever. The clock chimed behind me, but I didn't look back. There are some losses that never leave us. They simply learn to live differently inside us, softer, quieter, like a second heartbeat that keeps time with our own. Rusty had been that heartbeat. Arthur had been the rhythm. And somewhere between the two, I found my way back to life. I used to think love was about presence, about coffee cups and footsteps, about shared laughter echoing through rooms. But love, I've learned, is also about endurance. It's the letter tucked away, the dog who keeps the routine, the morning light that still insists on arriving. Love doesn't vanish when someone's gone, it just changes its address. Sometimes the ones we lose teach us how to live after them. Sometimes they leave guides, a paw print, a letter, a scent of lilac on a spring breeze, to remind us that we can keep walking, that we're meant to. Every morning, I still open the door. I breathe in the air, feel the sunlight touch my face, and whisper, "I'm here." Not for them to hear it, but for me, a promise to keep going, to honor what they gave me by living fully. If you've ever loved and lost, remember this. Grief is not proof that love has ended. It's proof that it was real. Let it stay with you, not as an anchor, but as a compass. Before you go, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had a moment when love seemed to return in a different form. And if this story touched something in you like it did in me, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, not for views, but for connection. Because stories like these remind us that love doesn't wait at the door. It walks beside us every step of the way.